Okay, we'll get started now. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining this month's Funk lecture. Before the talk begins, there are a few announcements I want to make on behalf of the Biogeography Society. What is happening? Sorry. Um, can you see the slides, Marta?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. All right, so we still have one more workshop coming up just in a few days. So if you're interested in microclimates and how to use microclimate data, definitely check this out. You can learn more about this on our website, biogeography.org. Members do pay a slightly lower fee. So if you're not a member yet, you can learn more about membership benefits on our website as well. The R House website for our biannual conference is now up and is linked to our website. Abstract submission is opening up in just a few days on June 1st and will close September 30th or September 1st. And early bird registration will end on October 30th. At the end of the talk, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have a question, you can either type it or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask it directly. And yeah, thank you again for attending. All of our funk lectures are recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. So if you found this talk interesting, you can rewatch it again later. And lastly, next month for our funk lecture, we'll have Jamie Cass as our speaker. And I will pass it over to Marta to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Raymond. I'm Marta Jerzyn. I am a Director for Public Affairs and Communications at KIPS. Thank you very much for joining us today for another installment of the Funk Biogeography Seminar Series. We are very excited to host Dr. Jacquelyn Gill today. Jacquelyn is a professor of paleoecology at the University of Maine's Climate Change Institute. She's a paleoecologist and a biogeographer, bringing the perspective of space and time to answer questions in ecology and global change science. Dr. Gill's work takes a community ecology approach to help understand how species and their interactions have responded to drivers such as climate and extinction through time. She's the head of the BEAST Lab, which investigates the legacies of biotic upheavals, such as extinction of Pleistocene megafauna on vegetation, biotic interactions and drivers of landscape change on large spatiotemporal scales, plant range dynamics and vulnerability to climate change, and what paleoecology, indigenous archaeology, and traditional ecological knowledge can tell us about human-environment interactions in the past. She's also a brilliant science communicator. She has gotten multiple awards, and she's a co-host of the podcast Warm Regards, a co-founder of the National March for Science, a 2020 recipient of NCSE Friend of the Planet Award, and an inaugural winner of the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Award for Excellence in Science Communication by the National Academy of Sciences, excuse me. And she also has a forthcoming podcast coming out about Earth history called Jack's and Phoebe Make a Planet. So check that out when it's out. But now, without further ado, Jacquelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak about this work and also for that lovely introduction. And it was really fun. I peeked into the attendees list and I see John Burks there, who taught me everything I know about pollen analysis back when I was still an undergrad. So I hope I do you justice today. So I'm really excited to share some uh, you know, very fresh, very new research that's coming out of our lab, much of which was done by my recent PhD student, Alessandro Marighetti, who, as I understand, has just accepted a postdoctoral position in Copenhagen. And so a lot of this work is very new, and I'm really excited to hear what you all think about this today. So, uh, while I'm a paleoecologist, I'm very motivated by graphs like this one, which we're moving into what can often feel like uncharted territory when it comes to global change, especially as we face a dual climate and extinction crisis, But as a paleoecologist, this is very much a perspective that we have on the past is very relevant to these problems. And I like to think of a couple of degrees Celsius, which might not be very much to you and I. We might not notice that from on a day-to-day basis, but on a planetary scale, it's quite relevant. And it's also quite relevant in that it represents, the sort of rate and magnitude of warming that we are expected to experience by the end of this century is really comparable to the climate change that we experienced during the last deglaciation. And so while the starting point is going here, today is going from warm to hot, and previously we went from cold to warm, we can say something meaningful about how species and their assemblages respond to this equivalent of climate change. This is a comic, one of my favorite web comics, XKCD, that really drives this point home that one ice age unit of climate change is the difference between, I would have been giving this talk under about half a mile of ice if this was 13 to 15,000 years ago. And we're looking at roughly an ice age unit of temperature change into the future. And so the natural experiments of the past are very much relevant to the everyday global change problems that we're facing now. And also they can be used to help us to test our theories in ecology and biogeography so that they're robust to time and to change. And of course, one of the big differences, two of the big differences that we would have would be first if this talk was happening 15,000 years ago, we would be under a lot of ice in many parts of the world. So here in North America, where the ice sheets were quite massive, they would have taken up a good, 50+% of available habitat. And so all of the species that you might work with if you work in modern settings, any species that you might see, if you look outside your window now, these are ice age survivors. These are species that were able to shift their ranges in response to the climate changes that drove the expansion of these ice sheets. The other major thing that you would notice that would be quite different, and this is true across the globe, is that the world would feel a little bit bigger in that we would have had these really large intact guilds of large herbivores. And so here in North America, where the extinction was especially acute, we lost something like half of the animals larger than an adult German Shepherd. And so we saw not just an overall reduction in body sizes on average, but we also lost our very largest animals. And this is really important because we know that large-bodied animals play really important roles in their communities today. They help to structure ecosystems. This doesn't come as a surprise when we look at modern day systems that still have relatively intact megaherbivore guilds. So if we go to places like the Serengeti, where we still have proboscideans and a number of other ungulates roaming around, we know that these animals play a really important role in mediating the relationship between grass and woody vegetation. They help to structure, the vegetation. They have huge impacts on plant species richness and coexistence. And they also, along with fire, help to mediate disturbance processes. And so these are, again, this is in a part of the world that still maintains their intact herbivore communities. But this is what a large portion of the globe would have looked like in terms of their large animal assemblages. So when I say that we've downsized planet Earth, we've removed the largest size classes in terms of body sizes from the planet. And that has had trophic consequences that are still playing out today in many systems, including in the Arctic. So that's where we're going to be focusing today's talk. And so during the height of the last glaciation, the mammoth steppe would have been the largest and most widespread biome in the world. It was circumboreal in the non-glaciated parts of Eurasia and North America. So south of the ice sheet or along the ice margin, you would have seen a highly productive dry or mesic steppe tundra that would have had a mixture of grasses and forbs and also woody plants. It would have been a steppe. There would have been small islands of trees. And if you were to look at any of those landscapes in the past, you would have seen that they would have supported very large and robust guilds of large herbivores. The back of the envelope calculations that people have done based on the richness of the fossil record has suggested that these would have been they would have sort of rivaled the Serengeti in terms of, or had even larger diversities of large herbivores, which is something that is really difficult to imagine if you go to a present day tundra where you might see a more wet, low productivity environment. And so that really has begged the question for quite some time uh, as to how that highly productive steppe tundra was maintained. Um, there's been some previous work that has found that so this if you're looking down here at an Arctic view of or a polar view of the planet, so here's Alaska, here's eastern Siberia. So this was a study by Eske Willerslev and others that came out in 2014 where they looked at snapshots of Arctic vegetation and megafaunal diets. And so they had three coprolites or frozen dung, five carcasses, so you could basically see the animal's last meal. And this is from a range of sites across the Arctic. And from the associated permafrost samples, they were able to reconstruct at this course level what the environments and diets would have looked like. And they found that there was an expansion of grasslands that was correlated with megafaunal extinctions. And in their paper, they posit that it's the expansion of grasslands that would have been implicated in the extinction of large herbivores. But there's a lot of research that shows that grasslands, sort of low diversity grasslands, tend to be a consequence of the removal of large herbivores. We know that grass makes up a large component of a lot of these animals' diets. And so there's been this long debate about the degree to which these systems have been maintained by top down or bottom up controls, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But in modern systems, there's been a significant amount of research on the role that herbivory plays in these tundra ecosystems. You can see that this has really taken off since the 90s, especially this sort of interaction between herbivory and climate change, and especially the role that these large herbivores might have played in, or might play today, in mediating the impacts of climate on these systems. And so a lot of this work has been experimental. So using exclosure experiments, people like Eric Post and others in Greenland and other regions of the Arctic. And there's mixed results from these sort of simplified systems where, and I say simplified because we're talking usually about one or two species of large herbivores, usually reindeer or caribou or muskox. But often there seems to be a growing consensus that in these modern systems, there's the large herbivores are playing a role in mediating the response of vegetation to climate change. And so if you experimentally warm a plot and exclude herbivores, you see a very large turnover in vegetation. Whereas in places where the herbivores are allowed to graze, you can see the maintenance of plant species richness, the persistence of rare species, and essentially it's as though large herbivores in these modern experiments are acting as a buffer between the impacts of climate on vegetation. And so we wanted to go to the fossil record to test this using this natural experiment of the last deglaciation. And we're working primarily in Eastern Beringia for this project, which I think is really exciting because there is a very patchy distribution of understanding climate change impacts across the Arctic. A lot of the work that's been done has happened in places like Alaska or Scandinavia, and there are large portions of Northern Eurasia that have been relatively understudied. Um, I should say, as a side note, that the work that we did took place in 2018 and 2019. So this was before the beginning of the global pandemic and also before Russia invaded Ukraine. And so the samples that we have are the samples that were probably the only samples we're ever going to get. So we were really grateful to be able to get those samples out of Russia before these sort of geopolitical changes. But I just wanted to kind of make that really clear that this was a project that began, that really had its inception prior to those changes. And so, as I mentioned before, these large herbivores are hypothesized to promote ecological resilience in Arctic systems. And that's both based on modern studies. And there's also what's known as the Zimov hypothesis, which suggests that Pleistocene and now extinct large herbivores would have played similar roles in their ecosystems as well. And the both observed and hypothetical actions of these large animals include reducing woody shrub encroachment, which is kind of a byproduct, it's thought, of the just the grazing action of these animals, especially in winter. I have deepening permafrost as a hypothetical role that these animals play. So the thinking is because they don't migrate out of these systems in the winter, they're brushing the snow away from the ground to expose last season's grasses, which provides the bulk of their diet in the winter. Again, this is theoretical. And so by removing that blanket of snow, you expose the ground to colder air temperatures, which allows the permafrost, the active layer, to become more shallow and the permafrost to become more robust over time. And that, plus the grazing and browsing action that these animals have, as well as possibly trampling or other forms of disturbance, is hypothesized to reduce the likelihood of woody shrub encroachment, which further helps to bolster the Arctic from warming temperatures. We know that's an important feedback mechanism that's happening right now on the ground in the Arctic. There's also some really exciting experimental work that's shown that because of their preferential grazing activity, large herbivores can actually, it might seem counterintuitive, but they can increase species richness and evenness and allow for the resilience of especially rare types, rare vegetation types and rare species. And when, versus ending up with something like a monoculture of grasses in many systems when you remove the disturbance action of herbivores. And so all of this together suggests that large herbivores, if you have intact guilds of native herbivores, or at least very close analogs, you can maintain some of these really important ecosystem functions. But folks like Eric Post and others have called this idea of, which is, been these hypotheses have been used to promote this idea of rewilding, like Pleistocene rewilding, or even de-extinction. But as Eric Post and others have pointed out, this is a theory-heavy, data-light hypothesis, right? We have a lot of hypothetical roles that these large animals would have played, but we've been a bit short on the data. And so, of course, the end Pleistocene extinctions in the Arctic represent this really exciting opportunity to test these roles with the appropriate time series data. And so to come back to this question of the mammoth steppe, this large and widespread biome that disappeared at the end of the last glaciation, the question has been, was this steppe maintained by top-down or bottom-up mechanisms? This is very classic. This is not just limited to the mammoth steppe biome, but there's been ongoing debates about the relative role that climate and trophic interactions have had on structuring plant communities, and those debates are ongoing, and it very much depends on where you look and when you look. And so under the sort of bottom-up model, we have a change in climate where you have low temperatures and precipitation results in a dry steppe tundra that's relatively diverse and able to support these large guilds of herbivores. Then, of course, the climate changes. We get warmer and wetter conditions in the tundra as we see as we move into the Holocene. And we see that shift from a productive dry steppe tundra to a low productivity, less diverse wet tundra where you see an increase in woody shrubs. So under that model, the large herbivores that rely on those productive dry steppe ecosystems are run out of food effectively. Their reproductive rates go down, and they're driven to extinction basically. So this is an environmental extinction model, both for the mammoth steppe and for the mammoth, right? On the top, under the top-down model, the idea is that herbivory, soil and vegetation disturbance, and enhanced permafrost depths, which are driven by the actions of these large herbivores, then promote patchy, diverse, and resilient steppe tundra with reduced woody encroachment. So you're sort of hijacking some of these positive feedback loops that can enhance warming in Arctic ecosystems. And so as long as you have those disturbance agents through the maintenance of diverse guilds of large herbivores, you can maintain the steppe tundra, similar to what we see in the Serengeti today. So under this model, the mammoths are keystone species of the mammoth steppe. So in that case, the mammoths are driven to extinction, either because of human hunting or some other mechanism. And it's their loss, the loss of those activities, that then drives a shift away from that productive dry steppe tundra to a low productivity wet tundra, right? So that's what we see in the Holocene. And so then to sort of summarize, what we're trying to understand is whether large herbivores were the ecosystem engineers of the mammoth steppe or whether they were the victims of its climate-driven extinction. And this is really important, not just for understanding the dynamics of extinction and how large, but also how the degree to which these large animals might have played a role in structuring ecosystems at the biome scale, at the scale of the largest biome on the planet. And so this question is really exciting for a lot of reasons. And one of them is that we really get to grapple with the role that these animals are playing, not just in terms of driving ecological resilience, so we can test some of those hypotheses that have emerged out of modern literature, but also to really understand the role that biotic interactions might be playing when we think about the biome scale, right? Where we typically, historically, have considered climate as being the primary driver at that level. So to test this, some members of my lab and I, we went to a region on the Indi-Gurkha River. There's a small village there known as Biogeography. As you can see, that this is in eastern Beringia. And so we have for this project, we're working kind of across both sides of the Bering Land Bridge, as well in Alaska as well. But for today's talk, I'm just going to focus on the Russian side, or the Eastern Siberian side. And so we have several fossil localities that are very close within that, less than 100 kilometers in distance. And so when I say the Belaya region, they're all of these sites are sort of clustered around in the Indi-Gurkha River region. And the reason this is a really cool place is you might have seen some of the really exciting permafrost mummies that have come out of this region. We call them mummies because they have preserved tissue, soft tissues, skin, feathers, fur, muscles, stomach contents, etc. And in this map, you can really see that this region has some of the deepest permafrost depths anywhere in the world. And so the permafrost being an incredible archive of natural materials. And so we're really relying on the ability of permafrost to record these past environments. And as you can see, these are full-sized larch and black spruce trees, and you have some willows here, but this is just a slump in that permafrost that I wanted to show you because it really exemplifies this really interesting and unique soil that is found in this region, known as Yedema, which is a very silty soil. It's made up of loess, which is a silty river deposit, and it's very organic rich. In some cases, it's many hundreds or even thousands of meters deep, and it can accumulate in these very rapidly. And you can see here in the slump, this is all frozen ground, and so you can see some of the ice wedges and other permafrost structures here. But what I really wanted you to focus on is just how organic rich this Yedema soil is. And so we went to the Indi-Gurkha River region. This is our lab mascot, Maggie, named after Margaret Davis. And what I wanted you to focus on here in the background of this photo is just how low the river is. This is the Indi-Gurkha River. It's normally all the way up to the tree line here. But you can also see this really very fine-grained silt. And it was really interesting walking around because it was unusually hot this year. Large parts of Siberia were on fire, but fortunately not where we were. But in this area, this really silty ground, you could really understand why it might be really treacherous to be a woolly mammoth walking around, because you could take a step in the wrong place and not realize it, and you'd end up to your waist in this like really thick, sucking, almost like quicksand mud. And it was actually pretty difficult to walk through. And so you can see this is in August, like fall comes early to the Arctic, but I wanted to show you that this is a pretty extensive taiga today, made up primarily of larches and spruces. We also have willows. You can again see that the river level is really low. This is my collaborator Luva Dahlin in Sweden. He's a paleogeneticist who works mostly with carnivores. But you can also just see there's several of them popping up throughout the ground here. These are not all logs. Some of these are bones. So that is a woolly rhino femur. And everywhere we stepped, there were just bones popping out of the ground, which really kind of emphasizes this idea that there must have been very large populations of these animals supported for a very long time to accumulate that number of fossils. The reason that we were there, just as a side note, is there's a group of people who live nearby in Biogeography known as the tusk hunters, and they are there to look for fossil ivory to meet the continuing demand for ivory throughout the world. And so what they do is they dig or they hydroblast these underground pits. So we would go into these permafrost tunnels that were created by the tusk hunters, and their role is to look for mammoth tusks. They don't get paid unless they find a mammoth tusk. This particular operation has the only sanctioned, I guess, or approved relationship where they can go out. They have a permit to be able to do this work because they have an established relationship with the Academy of Sciences at the Saha Republic. And so, as there's a continued demand globally for ivory, but it's now illegal to trade in modern ivory, there's been an increased interest in fossil ivory to fulfill the demand, which is really fascinating because it's not illegal to trade in the ivory of an extinct animal like a woolly mammoth. And so it's a very strange and kind of, I feel very conflicted about this relationship because on the one hand, you could argue that by supplying ancient ivory into the system, you're still promoting demand for ivory. On the other hand, you know, as a Westerner coming into this system where these people, like one tusk can feed your family for an entire year, it feels very like inappropriate for me to be telling them how to make a living. And we were also really fortunate because a lot of these tusk hunters were really curious and really interested in the system that they were working in, and they found a lot of really interesting material that I think would otherwise have been lost. But it's one of the reasons, we don't know whether there are no similar sites in, say, the Yukon or Alaska, or there just aren't people who are searching for those sites. So it's a little bit uncertain at this point. There may only be deposits like this in Russia. They may exist in places like Canada or Alaska, and we just haven't looked. So this is just to show you the operation for how we were able to access these samples. Again, you can see the river levels are extremely low this time of year, which is very unusual. But they basically would take these gas-powered engines with hoses and hydro mine. So it's on a smaller scale operation than like the gold mining in parts of Alaska and the Yukon. But because the water is just a little warmer than the permafrost, you end up being able to drill holes. And so what they do is they take the river boats up and down the river and they look for places where bones pop out of the riverbank. And then they start hydro mining in that location. And they describe that they often find what they call rivers of bone, which I think might be a feature of the permafrost freeze thaw action, kind of concentrating materials in these sort of linear deposits. I would love to actually do a proper excavation, but that's not currently possible. But they will often spend, once they find a good deposit, they will spend an entire summer excavating. And so I just wanted to show you what that looked like. I don't know if you noticed right here. So in this case, the water is running down into the tunnel underneath. They found something in the roof of the tunnel, so they came out on top and they excavated it from the top. So if any of you are paleontologists and you're feeling really uncomfortable right now by the complete lack of screening or any kind of, traditional excavation techniques, I feel your pain. It's very, very difficult to watch this, at least at first, when you sort of realize, oh my gosh, like what's all this small material or debitage, archaeological evidence that might be, washing out into the river. It's all just getting lost. You might have picked up on what this guy's excavating. Here's a mandible from a woolly mammoth. Here's a close-up of that material. This is my foot, women's bog boot, size 10 and a half for scale. And this is a woolly mammoth leg. This is the femur, this is the knee, this is the shin. this is the foot, and you can see that the foot pad is completely intact. This is not grass, this is fur. It's probably, it looks a little rough, but there's skin, there's flesh here. We actually ended up doing something, a kind of a quasi necropsy in the field, where we cut into the knee just to see how the patella fits on the knee bone, because everything was completely intact. So it was really an exciting find. But this is the sort of preservation that we were able to find here. Over and over again, we would see the same pattern where the top half would be clean and the bottom half would have, well-preserved tissues, which we think is because the animals might have gotten stuck or sunk into the mud, and then the top half would be exposed to predators or the elements or microbial activity, and then would break down. This is a wolverine skull. This is a female horned lark, which today is still around and is found in more open habitats. And so this was taken out of the permafrost tunnel as well. She dated to, I think, about 40,000 years old. We had a paper on this specimen. And this right here is a moth that was pulled out of some grass, and it was frozen in situ. I was there for its removal. We dated the grass to 40,000 years old, and you can see just how well preserved. You can't see it very well from this picture, but the proboscis of the moth is still intact. And so this moth's genome has been sequenced, and they're currently trying to find its closest match. But once you start to have really delicate materials that you don't normally have, it opens up a whole new world of questions. Just a couple more fun finds before I move on to the real meat, I guess. No pun intended. This is a piece of woolly mammoth skin. That's Dan Fisher from the University of Michigan, who's a paleontologist who specializes in mammoths. But this is really exciting because the skin is really thick, but there's also a cut on the side here that was not made by the tusk hunters or us. It came out of the permafrost that way. And here's another really exciting piece. This is a large flap of skin from the head of a woolly mammoth, including its ear. So you can see very small ear. You can see how thick the skin is. You can see the very long red fur. But what Dan is pointing out here, and what's really interesting, is that this piece of skin was not found in association with any bones. The skull was gone. And what Dan is pointing out is this sort of scalloped pattern that you might be able to see in the skin itself, which he says is indicative of when you're skinning an animal and you take a knife and you pull the knife towards you. I don't know if you can see in my picture. Your arm kind of makes that arcing motion as you process the material, and this is really common among people who process large game today. And so we have this like large piece of skin that's completely out of context, came out of the permafrost like that. And Dan sees both this and some of the other things from this area as evidence of butchering, which is really exciting because most of the items we've been finding have been dating to about 30 to 50,000 years ago. And there's no archaeological evidence in this region for people. I mean, it's a vast region. And so, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. So the absence of that evidence is not necessarily indicative, but it's really interesting to see the evidence of butchery, or what seems to be butchery, even in the absence of an archaeological record. This is a horrible photo, but when we were in the caves themselves, we had to be very quick, because if we stayed too long, the permafrost could warm up, and collapses are not uncommon. People have died doing this work as tusk hunters. But I just wanted to show you just a close-up of the grass, which still has pigment, that was thawed out of the permafrost. And this is the grass that the moth came out of that we dated to about 40,000 years old. And then there would also be these really interesting linear features that looked like they were old preserved ground surfaces with vegetation rooting down in. And just frozen along the wall here was this coprolite that looked just like some animal had just walked along and just taken a poop, and it just landed on the ground and was covered up with lus, and just sort of preserved as this sort of ancient moment in an animal's day, which I just couldn't believe it when I saw it. And it was frozen in place into the cave wall above us. And so, of course, that's the star of the show. We were able to find a large number, almost 60 of these frozen dung samples, including from multiple species. And when we first went to do this work, I was really excited, thinking that maybe what we could do is really understand coexistence on the mammoth steppe, reconstructing the diets of all of these different large herbivores. And I was really excited to do that based on some similar studies in terms of using DNA metabarcoding to look at dietary niche partitioning in Africa. And so, we're really leveraging these fecal samples as snapshots of fossil diets and environments. And so we're really recording these highly resolved data about ancient interactions. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can get dietary information from fossil organisms. We do have a couple of gut contents, but we're mostly focusing on the dung samples. We're calling them coprolites, but they're subfossil, like most of what we work with in the Pleistocene. And so we used ancient DNA to identify which animals created the dung, which we weren't sure if we would get anything back, and we did. And our original plans were completely thrown out the window because rather than getting this lovely distribution of different animals, we ended up getting almost all mammoths. So it was at least 45 woolly mammoths. We had some bison. We had 3 woolly rhinos. We had a couple of caribou. We got no horses. So there were several species that weren't well represented at all. And almost everything that we found was woolly mammoth, which was really interesting, and might say something about the relative abundance of these animals, compared to, say, woolly rhinos, which we think were more rare in these ecosystems, but also potentially the role that these animals played as keystone species. So I was pretty heartbroken when these results came back at first, just thinking that, what can I do with just 45 mammoths? And then we radiocarbon dated them. And what was really, really exciting about that is that we found that these data were clustered in 2 major time bins, one from a relatively warm period, which I'll come back to, and then one from a colder period. And as I mentioned, these are coming from 4 sites. We only have a couple from this purple site. Most of them are coming from Biogeography or another location very close by. And they're close enough that they shouldn't be they shouldn't be responding too differently in terms of their response to climate change. We also had a bunch of samples that were too old. They were older than the limits of radiocarbon dating, and so I'm going to restrict what we're showing you to those samples that we could date definitively. But we did get DNA results from these. We just have no idea how old they are. And so using paleoclimate reconstructions for this region, both from oxygen isotopes and also from a downscaled paleoclimate model, you can see that the environment was relatively similar across sites. This one site in purple here was a little different, but we only had a couple of samples and most of those were too old. And so primarily what we're comparing are the dark green and the orange. And you can see precipitation wise that they're coming out pretty similarly. There's some differences in terms of temperature, but the main thing is that the 2 time bins that we have cluster in a relatively warmer climate. I say warmer because we're still during full glacial conditions. And then also you see there's this downturn where we have this period of colder conditions as we approach the last glacial maximum. And so we ran a biomization model, which predicts that during this shift in climate, we should have seen a transition from a cooler shrub tundra with some steppe and taiga elements to a colder, more shrub tundra that was more dominated by dwarf and prostrate shrubs. And you might be thinking, what's the difference between shrub tundra and dwarf or prostrate shrub tundra? Isn't it all just tundra? It actually makes a difference, as I'll show you in a moment. But if we sort of place the biomization across these different sites, you can see that the model is really picking up this transition during this period where we have one of our clusters of samples. And so we're just calling that the cold dwarf shrub tundra. And then this earlier period is the cool shrub tundra. For a while, we were calling it warm, and then we realized look at these temperatures. They're not warm. They're just warmer. And so, in terms of a difference, maybe you're looking at this and not really noticing much of a change, but ecologically speaking, it is a difference. You have more elements of trees. The shrubs can grow up higher and up to your waist in some cases, versus these more low prostrate shrubs that are basically hugging the ground. And so, it is enough to drive a difference in terms of the plant functional types and the plant communities and just the structure of vegetation at this site. So we're sort of interpreting this as our null model, right? This is what we would predict based on just the climate alone, is that there is enough of a shift between these two climate intervals to suggest that we should be seeing a change in the vegetation at the time, and presumably in the diets of these animals. So again, just to show you the sort of clustering, we have one set of coprolites that is clustering to our cool shrub tundra, and the rest are all in this cold dwarf shrub tundra. Obviously nothing from the Holocene, because by that point, the mammoths were gone, and so was the mammoth steppe. All right. So just I have a couple ways to show you the pollen spectra. Another way to put this would be the last glacial maximum. So that's our cold interval. And then this is our cooler interval here, the pre-LGM. And you can see this is a sampling of some of the pollen data from these two different intervals. You can see that grass is making up a large component of the pollen, which is really interesting. If you compare this with the Willerslev et al. Paper in 2014, they found no evidence of grass, although that turns out to maybe have been an issue with the primers they were using for their DNA. And we also see large numbers or decent proportions of Artemisia, a number of other forbs, and we find elements of steppe, meadow, and grassland, and almost no woody plants, which is really interesting. So what I would say, though, about the pollen is that for a long time, people interpreted pollen data as being representative of diets. We don't think that that's correct. I there is pollen in my dung right now. It's pollinating pine heavily at the moment, but that does not mean that pine makes up a large proportion of my diet, right? Sorry to be crude there, but I think it really hits the point home. Pollen gets everywhere, and a lot of this is probably, we think, being ingested incidentally by these animals, rather than actually being eaten, unless we have a large spike in a particular type, which might be indicative of eating a flower or an anther or something. And so we're really interpreting our pollen data as representing a sample of the vegetation. So the mammoths and other animals were unintentionally sampling the plants for us. And if you compare some of the pollen data, this is at a slightly coarser scale, to the proportion of DNA reads, you can see that the pollen and the DNA are capturing different things. Not surprising. Other folks have pointed this out as well. Ancient DNA is a really great tool, but it is not going to put palynologists out of work just yet. If you look at the pollen data, we're seeing much higher volumes of grass, and also a lot of Artemisia that's almost totally absent from the DNA. Meanwhile, the DNA, which you can see here, Artemisia is in red, and so that's in the pollen, but not in the DNA. Meanwhile, the DNA is picking up a lot of shrub DNA, which is almost completely absent. So it might have been a seasonal timing issue, or something else. When we do think that there's evidence of woody browse happening, it's just not being captured in the pollen. We're also getting a much higher forb diversity, which makes sense. A lot of those forbs are often absent from our pollen records, especially in the Arctic, which can be really grass dominated in terms of the pollen. So these are really complementary records, but they're also showing us slightly different things, we think. This is, again, the landscape, and this is the diet. We also did look at plant macrofossils. We did have some pretty good preservation there. We're seeing several taxa that are not represented in the pollen records, including willow and sedges, as well as some Asteraceae, Brassicaceae, and Boraginaceae. And what's interesting is some of those taxa that we're finding in plant macrofossils and in DNA are plants that have high concentrations of toxins, which most animals then avoid them for that reason. And so it's interesting to think that possibly mammoths were maybe eating or had access to certain plants that other animals might not have. All right, so to get to this question about whether the mammoth steppe was maintained by these top-down or bottom-up mechanisms, we're just going to show you some NMDS plots, non-metric multidimensional scaling, to show you to basically to test this hypothesis. And so if the environment doesn't, this is just dummy data, to illustrate what we would expect. So if the environment does not change between this colder in blue and warmer, although again, not that warm in red, we would expect to see that their ellipses in the NMDS space would overlap. But if we see a large degree of environmental change across these two time bins, we would expect to see that those two ellipses do not overlap, which would indicate environmental change. So again, we're using the pollen data as a proxy for our environment or our regional vegetation, and the ancient DNA data is telling us something about the actual diets. All right, so if we look at the pollen, this is the real data now, you can see that we're not seeing very much of a change between the LGM and the pre-LGM time bins. So this warmer interval and this colder interval are have a pretty remarkable degree of overlap in NMDS space. And if you look at the ancient DNA data, we're also seeing that there's not a significant change in the diets of these animals across these two time periods, even though the climate models are suggesting that we should see at least some shift in vegetation between the two intervals, not just structural changes, but actual compositional changes. And so that suggests that the environment was relatively stable over this climate change, and that the diets themselves were not changing significantly. There are some small differences. For example, we do see more willow in the pollen in the warmer interval, which makes sense. But overall, we see that there's relatively little change between the two for NMDS. This is actually pretty good. And so we're interpreting that as representing relatively stable environments and relatively stable diets across this period of climate change. Um, I still wanted to look at the niche overlap, just because, I'm so interested in this question of coexistence and how you have these really large herbivore guilds. Of course, as I mentioned, we didn't get really good numbers in terms of the other taxa, but I still just wanted to show you, just for comparison, where all the different animals' diets sort of fall out in this space using ancient DNA. And so again, if we had low niche overlap, you would see very little overlap in their ellipses for the different taxa. If they're all eating the same things, the ellipses would be stacked on top of each other. So if we look at the data, caribou are over here, which makes sense, given their preferences for lichen. But we have rhino and bison completely encompassed by the woolly mammoth diet. Again, very low sample sizes, so I'm not reading too much into this, but it was just interesting to see that, at least at this scale, there's except for caribou, there's really nothing that the other grazers are eating that mammoths are also not eating. And also, mammoths had an incredibly broad diet. They were generalists, which is really interesting. They had a large diversity of vegetation represented in their diets. One last thing I wanted to show you, Alessandro had the very cool idea to stack the ancient DNA data by pollen abundance. And so there's two ways to look at that data here. One is by plant families, the other is by plant functional types. And we go from high pollen, which we're interpreting as summer diets, and low pollen, which we're interpreting as winter diets. And what's really, really cool here is that you can see the winter diets have a very high component of grasses, and you get more forb diversity in the summertime. And so this is really providing some mechanistic evidence for the idea that mammoths and other large herbivores would have brushed the snow away in the winter to access those last year's dry grasses, and then sort of exposing the ground to colder air temperatures as sort of a mechanism of promoting ecological resilience. And meanwhile, in the summertime, they're much more interested in taking advantage of the full diversity of forbs and also tender, new growth in your shrubs in the summer. And grass makes a much lower proportion of their diet in the summer months because they have so many other things to eat that they haven't just been eating all winter long, which is the majority of the season. So we think we have some evidence of some seasonal behavioral changes in terms of diets, which is really cool. All right, so to conclude, The mammoth steppe in the Biogeography region remained stable during a period of climate change, which our model suggests should at least have been represented by a shift in tundra types. And so we see this as evidence for top-down controls of the mammoth steppe biome, that mammoths were potentially ecological engineers that were helping to promote this ecosystem. They had very broad dietary and behavioral niches, which we think potentially could support some evidence for functional partitioning of their diets, as well as a little bit of dietary separation. So it's a mixture of approaches that would have enabled them to coexist with other species, especially if they had this keystone role. Um, and we're finding more evidence in the fossil record here that shows that these herbivores might have played an important role in maintaining ecosystem resilience. So by maintaining ecosystem complexity, richness, and diversity are often linked to stability, by facilitating coexistence, by having some degree of spatial or temporal niche partitioning. They might have facilitated the coexistence of not just many large herbivore species, which again, we have just some preliminary data that aligns with that hypothesis. But overall, this sort of role that these animals might have played in maintaining ecological resilience suggests that at least mammoths as keystone species acted as a buffer, sort of minimizing the impacts of climate change on these ecosystems. And just as another line of evidence, this is not what we set out to test, but of course, it's really difficult to talk about mammoths without talking about their extinction. The dietary evidence that we have suggests that a climate-induced habitat shift was not the primary driver of their extinction. The fact that we're also seeing evidence of butchering, from the same site is, I think, really exciting, although in and of itself not definitive in any way. But it's hard to imagine that that an animal with a very diverse and broad diet, including the ability to potentially access entire families of plants that are otherwise shut off from other genera, would have gone extinct because of a reduction in its forage, when we know that this animal was eating pretty much everything that was out there. So with that, I just want to leave you with some of the really cool work that we're doing with this is all made by undergrads here at the University of Maine. The resolution's coming through a little wonky, but we're generating Ice Age virtual reality experiences that will enable students in rural areas to have high quality science experiences. So people who might not otherwise ever get to a science museum or get to a fossil site or dig, they'll be able to go to the Pleistocene, walk around as an Ice Age ecologist and interact with the landscape, see mammoths doing things mammoths would have done, come up with cool hypotheses about their landscapes, and then play that role as ecologists, with this sort of immersive experience that we're creating. And I should just note that this work was funded by the United States National Science Foundation Career Award, which science funding in the US right now is being attacked, and none of this work, both in terms of the ecology, and also the outreach and education work we're doing with rural school children, would be possible without the National Science Foundation. So I really feel like it's extremely important right now to be pointing that out, that none of this would have been possible. The training of my student who just graduated, none of that would have been possible without our funding agencies, which is primarily NSF in this case. And of course, also, so there's Alessandro, and then these are all the test hunters, our field technician, Karen James, and our translator, Nadia from Yakutsk. None of this would be possible without them either. And so thanks. Hopefully we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Jacquelyn. This is great. Yes, we have like 7 minutes for questions, and I think there's something already in the Q&A box, so I will just read it out. It's a question from Priyanka Soni. Thanks for the great talk. Curious if you or earlier studies from the same sites found hominid fossils to see any co-occurrences.
Oh, it's such a great question.
Yeah.
There has not been very much archaeological work in this region at all. I mean, there's There's Denisova Cave, which is thousands of miles away, but where the Denisovan hominin group was sort of described. Um, Part of the issue is just that this is very under settled as a region, and so it's just vast in its scale. It's mind-boggling. The first time that I went just to see how big this place was. And so there has not been very much found, but there's also not been much investigated. And so I think it's just really a very, very, very big haystack to look for a needle in. And I think there's growing interest in the site or in the region, especially as more of these permafrost mummies have come out. There's other items that looked like they had been butchered. There was a wolf head that was completely severed. There was no body. There was a bison foreleg that had been cut off. The rest of the bison was not there, right? So it's little bits and pieces like this that um, are really consistent with butchery, but no tools, etc. And I think part of that could be because, you know, by partnering with the tusk hunters, it's hard to find things that are, like a stone chip or tool or a piece of a tool would be really hard to find. But in terms of the actual remains of hominins themselves, there's not been much done in that region at all. So yeah, great question.
Okay, so we're still waiting for some more questions. I have a question as we're waiting for someone else to pop in. So it sounds like woolly mammoths were ecological ecosystem engineers. Where do you then stand now on rewilding and, well, the extinction, I guess? I think I know where you stand on the extinction, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on either one of these
I
things.
think, yeah, I think, it's interesting. When I first started grad school, rewilding was the really controversial idea. And now I feel like it's much more widely accepted
Mhm.
now, especially now that we're talking about uh, releasing genetically modified mammothy elephants, into the Arctic, right? Suddenly rewilding just looks, perfectly normal in comparison. I think what this work shows is that to me is that I'm less interested in this idea of creating analogs, even functional analogs, through genetic means, because I think that entire process is very fraught. There's so much about being a mammoth that is more than the sum of its parts. These were animals with culture and inherited knowledge, right? They were matriarchal. There's so much that we know about them and their behavior that you can't capture by through genetic modification. And so, sort of leaving that aside, what I think work like this does show increasingly is that large herbivores give you a lot of bang for your buck if you want to focus on them from a conservation perspective in terms of the large home ranges that they need, the functional role that they play structuring ecosystems, and that to me I think gives us a direction to go. And also just knowing that they can kind of buffer the impacts of climate change, that gives us a little bit more time, especially in the Arctic, if you can think of ways to enhance existing large herbivore populations, or promote or protect them, or reintroduce them to places where they've been removed historically. That I think was the take home message here, and that thinking about keystones can be a really effective way to have all of these really positive knock-on effects that these large animals play in their ecosystems.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay. A question from Madhusudan Kati. Wonderful talk. I was about to ask about rewilding and the extinction. Okay, so we covered that. But there's another question. What does your work tell us about biodiversity in contemporary ecosystems, particularly anthropogenic ecosystems, social ecological systems such as farms or cities?
Oh, that's such a great question, because as soon as you bring big animals and even herbivores into urban or agricultural systems, you start running into human wildlife conflicts, which I know, Madhu, you're, really like you talk about this a lot too. I think it's a matter of figuring out ways to, looking at places in the world where those kinds of interactions have been mediated successfully. And I know that there are places where bringing people into management and having them really feel like these large animals are a part of their culture can be a really important key to do it to accomplishing that. I don't think that the answer here is the complete separation of people and nature, where we cordon off large swaths of the planet, because that's just another land grab, usually from indigenous peoples. And what's really exciting to me about rewilding, people often ask me, well, what do indigenous communities think about rewilding? And honestly, the best examples of rewilding that I'm seeing right now are largely being motivated and driven by indigenous communities in places like First Nations in Canada and Native tribes here in the US, where bison reintroductions are of extreme interest, and there's some really cool work being done. And so I think those positive examples where we have in some cases millennia of interactions to witness and to learn from, is where I would turn my attention, and partnering with like urban ecologists like you, where and I promise like Madhu didn't like tee me up with this question, but I just think it's really important, like we you know paleoecology should not be siloed in the way that it has been. And we have this real opportunity to bring together conservation and paleo and sort of modern, socio-ecological systems, thinking all together. And because people have been in all of these paleo landscapes that we've been studying for millennia too. And so I would love to just see the humans be brought into that conversation much more, even in the paleo realm, where we've often just sort of described humans vaguely as this like possible other thing that might explain what we're looking at if we can't explain it with climate. And I don't think that's the right way to do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Jacqueline. We are out of time, so we're just gonna let you go.
Sounds good.
Yeah, again, thank you so much. Your talk will be posted on our YouTube channel within a week or so. And yeah, well, thank you to our audience as well for showing up. And please join us next month.
Yeah, feel free to
Bye,
email
everyone.
me too. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, Jacqueline.
Bye.